Thank you. Those were wonderful, wonderful talks. Really interesting, important questions. What makes them so important and exciting is that they're asking these really basic questions that we all ask all of the time. Like how do we explain our world? What could be more basic than that? Another way to put it is, what is the answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything? And of course, we all already know the answer to that question. Or at least Douglas Adams would like to suggest that we know the answer to that question. So 42, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that explanation? Well, for one, it doesn't make us feel like we know a whole lot than we knew before. It's not very emotionally satisfying for some reason. It doesn't really help us make any additional predictions about the domain. So because this isn't terribly satisfying, we rely on 3 other prominent forms of explanation. And these 3 forms of explanation have been used, throughout history to explain the world. Now, the 2 talks today focused on science and religion, and so I'll say some about that, but I do want to try to work magic back into the equation, and so I'll try to do that as well, primarily toward the end. Okay, so I'm just going to do a very brief summary since we just heard these 2 talks. I don't think I need to go into them too much, but Bob McCauley's thesis is that religion is natural and science is not. That religious beliefs are aligned with our naive intuitions and biases. So for example, many have argued that we come into the world with this bias to perceive agents in everything. And that makes it easier for us to believe in something like a God that is responsible for and controlling a lot of what goes on. The products of science are hard to learn at the same time. There are all kinds of interesting cognitive barriers, biases that Bob talked about. There's lots of interesting research that shows that people have a really hard time understanding really basic physics concepts. And even Dawkins has talked about, with regard to evolution, that it's almost as if the human brain were specifically designed to misunderstand Darwinism and to find it hard to believe. So what evidence is there that these ideas that Bob has put forward are actually operating, and in particular operating in young children who perhaps have these intuitive biases? And as it turns out, if you look at the developmental literature, there's a fair amount of evidence for alignment between our intuitive biases and our beliefs, religious beliefs in particular. So Deb Kellerman has done work arguing that young children have what she calls a promiscuous teleology. And the idea there is that very young children basically have sort of theological beliefs at a young age that are just really intuitive. So according to her work, children think that, for example, everything has a purpose. So she'll ask children questions like, for example, where did the first river come from? Or why do rivers exist? And children will say things like that rivers exist so that animals can have a place to drink water. Margaret Evans has found that with regard to children's beliefs about origins, like the origins of people or plants or animals, that even children in non-religious families initially favor creationist beliefs over evolutionist beliefs, suggesting that perhaps it's somehow easier to acquire these kinds of beliefs. Susan Gelman and her colleagues have talked about essentialism, another example. The idea here is that very young children believe that everything has an essence, an immutable essence. And that makes it really hard also to think about something as evolving from something else. So all of these are consistent with the ideas that Bob has put forward. But I want to talk about a couple of other pieces of evidence that may or may not be as consistent. And I'd like us to maybe think about different kinds of evidence that may or may not be as consistent. And one is that religious concepts aren't always easier to believe than scientific concepts. And the other one is that religious and other supernatural explanations are not always prioritized by children. So with regard to the first, it turns out that children make subtle distinctions between invisible scientific entities like germs and invisible religious entities like angels. And Paul Harris, who's here today and will speak later, and his colleagues have shown that children exert the existence of scientific entities with more confidence, and they're also more likely to claim that other people believe in scientific entities. additionally, with age, all children continue to accept the existence of invisible scientific entities like germs, but not all children continue to believe in angels and other sorts of similar things. So I'd also like to argue that religious entities are unique in requiring the sort of cultural support that maintains these kinds of beliefs. Secondly, with regard to how children explain unusual events, I want to just briefly mention some data that is coming out of my lab. What we did is we presented 5 to 9-year-old children with all kinds of sort of what we'd call different sorts of events, ranging from mundane events to improbable events to impossible events. And we just asked them to explain how the events happened. And interestingly, the impossible events were events that a previous group of fairly religious children had suggested to us were miraculous. And these were everyday events, things that happened to them in their everyday lives, like, for example, finding a book at the library all of a sudden when it wasn't there before. Or, your dog, the doctor said your dog was dead, but he actually sort of came back to life. Someone broke her arm and it healed in a week instead of 2 months. These were all real life examples that we took and sort of transformed into these 3 types of events. And I'm not going to go over this graph with you because I don't want to dwell on my data for very long, but I just want you to look at the preponderance of green bars in here. What you see here are all different kinds of explanations that the subjects gave us, these 5 to 9-year-olds and adults, but the green bars are the natural explanations. And what we saw was just a preponderance of natural explanations, even for the impossible events, which was kind of surprising. And we just really got the sense that children were trying, and adults were just trying as hard as they could to come up with natural explanations, even for these completely impossible events. Okay, so let me move on to Tanya's talk. The question addressed here was, does a scientific explanation threaten the integrity of a religious belief? And interestingly, providing a neural basis for beliefs really didn't threaten the belief unless it was said to be an abnormality. And we've just heard about this, so I'll just be brief. This is found for a variety of different kinds of beliefs and different kinds of scientific explanation. And very interestingly, it affects attitudes towards science in general, with sort of hearing about these abnormal bases can make people sort of skeptical toward science in general. And then very interestingly, that more highly religious people tend to see a more limited role for science as an explanatory tool. So this is all extremely fascinating. And what I want to do about this is move back to the more general question of whether science and religion really are in conflict, as some of these data suggest they are, and some of them suggest that they aren't. And one finding that's really important to note is that people do often synthesize scientific and religious explanations. For one, nearly 40% of American adults believe in some form of theistic evolution, some kind of combination of evolution and creationism. It's quite common in adults. Adults use the brain to explain cognitive functions and use the soul to explain emotion. So they're kind of, again, appealing to both to explain similar phenomena. In some of Christine's own work, she's shown that both children and adults will often combine witchcraft and science to explain the occurrence of AIDS. And she's got some great, wonderful quotes in that paper about something like a witch can put you in the way of viruses or something like that. So it's just a really great example of synthesizing these. And then also, again, in some of my own work that I've done with Chelsea Cornelius and Walter Lacey, we've shown that both children and adults will endorse natural and supernatural explanations for the very same event. So they'll give us a natural explanation, but then they'll say it's also a miracle or it's also due to luck. For the rest of my remaining minutes, what I want to do is I want to really look at these questions of science and religion and magic in concert or in conflict through the eyes of young children. And so what I've done is I've gone through one of my favorite books of all time, which is a book by Vivienne Gusson-Paley called Wally's Stories. Are any of you familiar with that one? A few of you. And I want to show you how very young children are considering these same big existential questions that we're considering today. And I want us to think a little bit about whether science and religion and magic sort of start out intertwined or start out separate. And basically, I'm going to give you just a sort of off-the-cuff proposal for how things develop here. So first of all, these are kindergarten children. They're discussing species change. And in particular, it's a discussion about whether a boy can become a lion, or in the second example, kind of the reverse. And the child here says, he can wish for it, and if God wants you to become that, then you can do it. And then they sort of discuss whether it could work the other way around. If God wanted that, first he finds out if the girl lion really wants to become a girl person, and then he tells a fairy to do it because he's busy. So just what I want you to note here is just how religion and magic are really intertwined here. You know, wishing and God and fairies, and you know, if one person's busy, the other one does it. Young children also discuss the existence of invisible beings. In this case, not God necessarily, but the man on the moon. There's no air there, no air. But air is invisible, so how can there be no air? Now you see why we study children. Only the moon man sees it. He makes himself invisible so he can see it. Aren't they brilliant? My cousin says you can wish on him. Well, the moon is right next to God, so he could talk to God. Okay, so again, kind of wishing and God and invisibility. So it's sort of science, magic, and religion, all kind of interwoven. And my last example addresses the origin of plants. Little girl says, God could put a wish inside a plant. The teacher asks, what would the wish be? She says, well, what if it's a pretty flower? Then God puts an idea inside to make this plant into a pretty red flower, if it's supposed to be red. So a lot of kind of interweaving. And these conversations were all ones that took place at the beginning of the kindergarten year. And I want to give you one toward the end of the kindergarten year, because I think what's happening is children are kind of learning the conflict. There's probably a better way to say that. But so there's still this discussion about the child turning to the lion was sort of revived. And Harry says, scientists could work hard and make up a formula to make someone into a lion. Talia, the only kind of magic I've heard of are miracles. Sally, I think there might be a potion someday, a potion to make someone a lion, but it might not happen. Harry, they might not be able to make him into a lion, but make him look like a lion, with all the doctors working hard to do it. Sally, you mean to look like a lion but not talking like a lion, not roaring or anything? No, it wouldn't be magic. It'd be something to do with science. So you can kind of see how these domains are kind of developing and maybe sort of separating, and you know, they've got science, magic, and religion all going on in this one conversation, but unlike the kids earlier in the year, they're really sort of starting to, I think, this is suggesting that children are starting to separate them into domains and to sort of realize that certain explanations go with certain domains and certain explanations don't. So, hence, I want to say one other thing is that Bob mentioned the appearance-reality distinction and how sort of, I guess, how much of a part this is of learning sort of basic physics and basic understanding of the world, because appearance and reality are often in conflict. And so I do think that learning basic distinctions like the appearance-reality distinction plays a role in children's sort of forming of these different domains. And in particular, like something looking like a lion is in the domain of science, but actually a person becoming a lion, that might be more kind of in the domain of magic. And so I think that these basic distinctions allow children to divide the world into these different kind of categories of things that lend themselves to different kinds of explanations. And there's some evidence also out of our lab looking at children's understanding of invisible entities that shows that by age 7, and not before in our data, by age 7 children understand that invisible real things like germs could potentially be seen, perhaps if you had a microscope, whereas invisible not real things like an imaginary friend can't ever be seen. So they're starting to realize that these types of things have kind of different affordances, you might say. And so here's my kind of off-the-cuff trajectory. It's not really that wild or anything. There's just not a lot of evidence for parts of it. So at first, I would say that maybe these domains are undifferentiated in children, that science and magic and religion are all kind of, it's just a free-for-all. You can use them together, you can interweave them, etc. But what I'm suggesting might be the case here is that maybe there's a point at which they become differentiated, and that maybe during that period we might see some rigidity. Now, I don't know, I don't have evidence for this, but it may be that as they become differentiated, as you saw in that last conversation about the lion, that children really, for perhaps a short period of time, resist using different kinds of explanation for different phenomena. Sort of like overgeneralization or other phenomena that we see with kids where when they first learn something, they're very rigid, and then they kind of loosen up once they become more confident or more fluid. So maybe there's a period during which children are really rigid and don't interweave these kinds of explanations. But then at some point, as children get older, and I could guess, it probably depends on the domain, but maybe early elementary school years or something like that, children sort of start to be more flexible and to use different explanations for different domains and to be more accepting of the possibility of multiple explanations and coexistence of explanation. And so I want to end with a quote that does kind of a nice job interweaving these domains. And actually, I'm going to introduce a new topic that I assume and hope will come up later in our schedule, which is the issue of spirituality. And I want to end with this quote by Carl Sagan. He says, "Science is not only compatible with spirituality, it's a profound source of spirituality. When we recognize our place in an immensity of light year and in the passage of ages, when we grasp the intricacy, beauty, and subtlety of life, then that soaring feeling, that sense of elation and humility combined is surely spiritual." Typo. Thank you.